I'm waiting 4 o'clock and 1 minute. Well, are you okay, Alejandro? So maybe we can start now. Hello, everyone. I would like to introduce Alejandro Capparos, a friend and a colleague. Alejandro is a research director at the CSIC, which is the equivalent of CNRS in Madrid, and is currently the president of the Spanish-Portuguese Association of Natural and Environmental Resource Economics, where the name is AERNA. So his research areas are green accounting, with a special focus on forestry, and the second topic is international negotiation of climate change, and it is the topic of this talk today. And the paper is available on the website of Sweden. So he's an expert of both subjects, but this time I asked him to present his last paper on climate change negotiation. So I've been working with Alejandro for a long time ago, since he's the first postdoc at CIRED, which is a partner of this seminar program. So I would like to also mention Taritas Diet, because it was one of co-author. So my presentation is a bit too long, so now it's your turn to speak. And as always, I will relay the questions of the audience and open the discussion. So during the talk, we can have some question of clarification, and at the end, you will have a large discussion with the audience. So it's your turn to present your paper. Thank you, Alejandro, for being here.
Thank you very much, Christophe, and all the others for organizing this very nice series of seminars. Thank you very much for having me here. So as Jean-Christophe said, this is going to be a paper on international negotiations using bargaining theory mainly, not only, but mainly. This is a topic that I have been researching for many years, as you mentioned, with Jean-Christophe Perrault and Taritas Diet. So many of the ideas that I'm going to use come from the original research with them. This paper is, I'm alone, but we have been working on many papers together, and they are still doing that. Anyway, what I'm presenting here is a paper on pledge and implement bargaining in the Paris Agreement on climate change. So let's just move forward. So global warming is, as you all know, is one of the most significant of all environmental externalities and the ultimate challenge for economics. That was Nordhaus says in his presidential address. So the thing is, we have 3 key agreements to address climate change. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in '92, the Kyoto Protocol in '97, and the Paris Agreement in 2015. I'm going to argue that most of the literature, at least the theoretical one, has been focusing on the Kyoto Protocol, and there is very little literature on trying to model the Paris Agreement. So my goal here will be to try to present a model of the Paris Agreement. So let's see what are some of the key ingredients of this Paris Agreement. So it's a long-term agreement. There are goals for the second half of the century. This is subject to the unanimity rule in the sense that it was agreed by all the countries, and they agreed on this very long, targets that they have set for the end of the century. But there's a second feature, a very important one. It requests each country to outline and communicate their post-2020 climate actions, what is known as their nationally determined contribution. And here it's important to stress the nationally. So here countries submit what is conditional and unconditional NDCs. I will go back to that later. This is not subject to the unanimity rule. So you don't have to accept it all together. So you just submit whatever you want, and each country submits whatever they want as conditional and unconditional NDCs, and it's just registered in a registry, and that's all. And then it's updated every 5 years. So you don't have, there is no negotiation going on. I will do more if you do more. That was in the Kyoto Protocol. So the US, so the EU said, for example, I will do an 8% if you do a 7 to the US, or I would do less if you do less. There's nothing like that. There's no negotiation going on. You simply submit what you say you're going to do. So that's why it's important to keep in mind these nationally determined contributions. These are not legally binding, not even under international law. So Kyoto Protocol was binding on international law, but this is not. So this is why they're called pledges. You are pledging that you're going to do that. Afterwards, there's supposed to be a review system, whether you maintain it or not. And there's supposed to be some name and shame that if you don't like it, if you don't meet your targets, but that's all. So you have to pledge your targets, but they're not binding, not even on international law. And as I said, it is clearly not a burden sharing agreement. So 184 countries have submitted their first NDCs. So participation is not an issue. So most of what we have been dealing with the Kyoto Protocol, which was a big problem with the participation. And also if you go into the literature on international environmental agreements, participation is always a big deal. Here it's not important, everyone is participating. But we are not on track for the target. For the degree target of warming, we're not on target, let alone for the 1.5. Basically, this is a paper of 2016, but it roughly remains correct. So current policies are about 25% of the target. National determined contributions would add a 25%, and they're still pending an additional 50%. So, and what is also important is NDCs, you have two types, conditional ones and unconditional ones. Conditional ones are those depending on funding. So you have developing countries mainly saying, I will do this much if you don't help me, but I will do more if you help me, if you send me transfers. 45% have conditional and unconditional components, and 20% are purely unconditional. So we cannot focus only on the purely unconditional, which is what developed countries have done, most of them, because we have a big chunk of the effort to be done, which is in conditional form. There's also, I'm now at the IPCC on the chapter International Cooperation. We have updated this data, but still soon will come out that conditional is about 50% of all the effort that is to be done is in the form of conditional. And it is not clear who is going to pay for that. And this is what an important part. So you have to distinguish this conditional from the unconditional ones. So what is my interpretation, what I'm going to bring into my model? So there's a long-term agreement, yes, that the long-term goals in the rule book. There are pledges, which are conditional and unconditional, as I said, and they're short-term. And then very important for my model, for my interpretation, is the implementation phase. So after you have these pledges, which have been sent, a second feature of the Paris Agreement, or third if you want, is that there will be short-term agreements under Article 6 and Article 6 and 9. Article 6 says that countries may cooperate voluntarily to increase the reach of their abatement targets. And then you can sign binding agreements. They can be bilateral or they can be multilateral, the regional or even multilateral global. And then you have Article 9 that says there will be monetary transfers from developed countries to developing countries with a floor from 2025 onwards of 100 billion a year. So it's a significant amount of money. We already had some of these bilateral agreements. Like in November 2020, the Swiss Confederation and Peru signed an implementation agreement to the Paris Agreement. And they have concrete obligations in this agreement. A few months later, the Swiss Confederation also signed another one with Ghana. So there's already movement from developed countries trying to make agreements with developing countries because they know that way it's going to be much cheaper to reach their targets. So this is this implementation phase. And there's also in 2020, at the end of November, a paper by Kinley, Samit Kutajar, Debo, and Figueres, with basically all the living former executive secretaries of the UNFCCC. And they insist also that now it's a time for implementation. We need implementation agreements. So that's why even though in general this is known as pledge and review, so you have the pledge phase and then a review phase where you simply see who has met the target and who not, I talk about pledge and implement in my paper. So I say we have a pledge phase and an implementation phase. We need both, and both are going to be very important in the future, hopefully, if it's going to be a meaningful agreement. So what is the model and what we learn? A preview, and then I will go into more detail. So the first thing is, can such a weak agreement, does the Paris Agreement have an impact? That's the first question. When you read the Paris Agreement as an economist, you see, is this going to have any impact? Well, yes, as my model says, yes, on the first base is unlikely, but there's but the implementation phase and conditional pledges are crucial for that to happen. Important, all countries will have incentives to submit pledges. So unlike the Kyoto Protocol, here you have an incentive to submit your pledge. That's why we've seen all have done it. Long-term provisions, on the contrary, are relevant and are clearly underdeveloped in the current version of the Paris Agreement. And in terms of modeling, well, my paper, the main contributions are multilateral could be seen as a multilateral bargaining game with partial commitment, which is then introduced in a long-term agreement. And I show that has a unique solution, which is not trivial in these kinds of models. So the model will have two parts. One is this, what is called this pledge and implement bargaining, short-term version, basically. And then this long-term provisions, part 2. Even in part 1, we will have 2 phases, and I will focus mostly on part 1. Part 2, I will, in interest of time, I will leave it to the end, but I don't think I will have time to go into much detail in that part. So basically, we will have the long-term thing is you have the signature for long-term provision, which is basically when you sign the Paris Agreement 2015. Then you have an investment stage where you decide whether you do long-term investments, whether you decide you do green technology or not. You go more into building a nuclear power plant or building a coal plant, and this will last over the whole period. Because our game, basically, we are going to net zero by 2050, 2060. Well, it is true that any investment right now will cover mostly all of the period. To simplify the model, I have only one investment stage. I could have several. It would not change many of the results. Then we have some state of nature realized. We will have some uncertainty. But now we're going to focus only on what happens afterwards, once the state of nature is realized as well, which we have this pledge phase and implementation phase, the one I mentioned before. This is going to be the focus of my presentation, at least in the first instance. So we have this pledge phase where countries submit simultaneously the conditional and unconditional pledges. Unconditional pledges are independent of the behavior of other countries. So you say what you are going to do independently of what others do. And conditional pledges and abatement efforts, which are conditional on transfers on the behavior of other countries. Okay. In the implementation phase afterwards, if all countries submit only unconditional pledges, well, everyone is to implement their own pledges. If there at least one country submits a conditional pledge, then there will be a negotiation on how do we implement this additional effort, whether we do it or not, who's going to pay for it and how much. This is basically going to be Article 6 and Article 9 if you go to the Paris Agreement. Of course, as I said before, this is name and shame. So pledges have a cost if you revoke them. So if you don't meet your targets, it has a cost. It can be seen as a reputational cost. I introduce it in the utility function, of course, but basically here the idea is that you suffer, your utility suffers if you don't meet your target. And more precisely, it suffers more the greater the distance from the initial pledge that you made. So if you say that you're gonna obtain a transfer of 10 and you obtain a transfer of 5, it is worse for you, not only because you received less, because also because you suffered from losing your pledge, but it also goes in the other direction. If you say that you will only submit 10 and you end up submitting 15, then it has a cost for you. So in the long-term part that we're going to analyze more in detail later, we have this long-term non-binding provisions as part of the Paris Agreement. As I said, again, no burden sharing agreement. In our parties can denounce the long-term provision at any moment. We have, as I said, a sequence of short-term interactions, pledge and implement under the umbrella of these long-term provisions. We will have an uncertainty and we have 2 forms of incompleteness. Investments are not contractable while abatement is. So that's why I call it non-comprehensive. And agreements can or not be contingent on the realization of the stochastic variable. It can be contingent or non-contingent. But this is more for the second part on the long-term provision. So very briefly now mention, well, there's a vast literature. Basically, we have a book with Michael Finus covering this literature, the most important contributions, basically reprinting the most important ones. Basic message, all assume a burden sharing agreement or security protocol, and you cannot really apply them. There are a couple of working papers trying to model the Paris Agreement. There is one by Bart Harstadt, and he focuses on he has also a pledge phase, integrated and long-term analysis, very similar in that sense. He doesn't distinguish between conditional and unconditional. So the one sense we are complementary because I focus more on the conditional one and he focuses only on unconditional ones. And the big difference is that NDCs are either accepted by other countries or freely submitted. He assumes that countries have to accept these NDCs and resubmit them if they're not accepted by at least one country. My interpretation is rather that the NDCs, you just submit them and they're just annotated. You don't need, no one can say, I don't accept this pledge. So these are the main difference. Then Dutta and Ratner have another one, but this is a very different one, showing that you can get to the first base to the climate fund, business as usual as a threat, stackable leader features, no focus on pledges. So this is a very different approach. This is very different to my approach. So basically the message again, there is nothing there. that is the same than my paper, of course. Then bargaining literature. There are a couple of bilateral bargaining models which are related to my partial commitment paper here. Muto did it with the Nash bargaining solution, Leventoglu and Tarrar as well with the Rubinstein, but these are 2 players. I'm going to extend it to more than 2 players, and that changes significantly the way you have to prove it, and also the way you have to prove uniqueness, especially. And I will integrate into this long-term model as well. Incomplete contrast literature. Well, here there's a huge literature. I don't have time now to go into the details. Basically, again, is most of the results that are obtained on this part, even though the novelty is integrating this with my partial commitment bargaining, the rest of the results are relatively standard. I would argue, again, none of the models is exactly what is interesting to model the Paris Agreement. Most of them are 2 countries only, or two players. There is what is called self-investment. I have so that here you are affecting the disagreement point, what is not the case if you are a buyer and a seller, where disagreement is no trade. So there are differences, but basically similar approaches as this incomplete contract literature. So basically, as I said, the bargaining part is the most novel one, and the adaptation of the long term to the particularities of the Paris Agreement, which makes it quite different to what is out there in the rest of the papers. And integrating both is the other interesting part, I would argue. Okay, now let's focus on part 1. So this is now the pledge and implement bargaining. So the part where we are pledging something and then bargaining in the implementation phase. The end countries, there's a discount rate, the discount factor, gross payoffs before transfers is B of capital Q, that's of all the abatement that all countries have done, minus the cost that you pay only from the abatement that you do. This is absolutely standard, and also the functions are absolutely standard for benefit and cost functions, so nothing particular here. So what is going to happen if you have no interactions? Well, you can obtain, of course, the Nash equilibrium, solving for each one solves independently, taking the assumption of the rest, and as given the effort of the rest, and then you obtain what is the Nash equilibrium of this game, which I notate Q, lowercase q, with an A of outer Q. So there are no pledges, there are no negotiations, there's nothing. This is just the benchmark. Of course, this implies already a positive level of abatement for everyone. So that's why our long-term model is also going to be different, because you will have not that there's no trade. You will have this agreement payoff with people countries already doing some effort. So pledge phase, implementation phase. Pledge phase, countries submit simultaneously the conditional and unconditional pledges. Implementation phase and multilateral bargaining with cost of revoking. Multilateral bargaining, afterwards I will argue it could also be a set of bilateral agreements, but here to simplify, I will assume that the implementation phase is also multilateral bargaining, but would not change much if it's a set of bilateral agreements. So unconditional pledges are independent of the behavior of other countries. Each country submits its own pledge abatement effort. So basically you're taking as giving the effort of the rest. So basically an unconditional pledge is almost a definition of a Nash equilibrium. So of course, the result is that it is going to be the Nash equilibrium, but everyone is going to submit in an as unconditional NDC. So that means that if you focus only on the NDCs, these are basically the Nash equilibrium of the game. So you don't move anything out there, and then the abatement offers will be smaller than the aggregate level will be below the first best. So we will not achieve the social optimum if we all follow only our unconditional pledges, because they are simply the Nash equilibrium, because it's what you do independently of the behavior of other countries. Of course, assuming that they're doing a maximization as well. So this says that we need to focus on the conditional pledges. So conditional pledges, I do 2 versions. The first one is closer to what is actually in negotiations. The second one is actually more useful for me for the mathematical presentation. So what is a conditional pledge? By a country I is a pair formed by an amendment pledge for player I. You say Spain will do more than or Argentina. I will do more than my unconditional. I will do a QI capital C from conditional, and I'm requesting a transfer, or I am offering a transfer. Depending on the type of countries, you will have that if you're a developed country, you are offering a transfer. If you're a developing country, you are requesting a transfer in exchange of moving from the unconditional to the conditional situation. So you are asking it for yourself, transfer for yourself, or you're proposing a transfer to one country or to a set of countries you can potentially give it to all countries. So you define to how many you submit a full vector of quantities for all the other ones, but of course additional quantities, sorry, but this can of course be 0 for many countries. You can do it as you wish. This would be in the form of transfer. This is the closer to what is actually the NDCs look like. There's a big variety of NDCs, but most of them would be in terms of transfers. Here, the problem with that is then that if I'm measuring, before I said that you have the distance, depending on how far you are from what you obtain at the end, from what you asked initially in the pledge, it is going to be a distance which can be positive or negative, because we have positive and negative values. And there are other problems, so I transform into a share. It's important to keep in mind that it's actually the same. In a bargaining problem, you can always say, I do it in forms of the mathematical process. I do it in forms of transfers, or I do it in forms of shares of the additional surplus that is created. Afterwards, I always translate the one into the other one. So basically, conditional pledge, as I said, implies that at least one country will a bit more if implemented. So there is an additional surplus that will be created, which I denote with delta, capital delta. And it's the difference of what countries in the multilateral agreement obtain from moving from QA to QC. So now a conditional pledge, I can also write it as an abatement vector, noted how much all other countries I say have to do, even though it can be 0 for some of them, or simply QU instead. So or QA, I could put this in. I don't have to do for every single country additional, only for at least one. And I request a share for country I, for myself, for Argentina, of the additional surplus created equal to alpha I. So now it's important to keep in mind that asking for a surplus, a share of a surplus, is the same as asking for a transfer or proposing a transfer, depending which one is your position. But this is now everyone wants more share. So that's why it's better, and the distance is easier to compute with. So now I have, as I said, cost of revoking. So if you're asking a share at the beginning, share alpha I, and you obtain a share phi I over phi I, then if what you obtain is larger than what you said at the beginning that you're going to obtain, you don't have cost of revoking. If you obtain less, you have a linear cost of revoking. So the distance, the larger the distance between what you said you asked for and what you finally obtained, is your cost of revoking, what you suffer from not obtaining what you asked in the deal. So essentially, what if you have to change your initial position and vary it, then you will have this cost of revoking, which can come into my model. Okay. So at the end, the net payoffs take this form. So you have what you obtain from the agreement payoff, what you obtain in the case of the disagreement, plus a share of, if we move from this agreement to our agreement, if we can, if it may be the case that we don't have an agreement, but if we have it, you get a share of this additional surplus, minus potentially the cost of changing the share of cost of not meeting your pledge in particular. So implementation phase, countries either implement a conditional abatement or sign agreements based on Article 6 or Article 9 to implement additional efforts, including the conditional pledges. I assume that agreements are negotiated following a standard offer and counter-offer procedure, but taking into account that modifying the position set out in the pledges has cost, as I said before. If there is no agreement, or if the countries implement the unconditional abatement efforts, okay? I further assume, make a set of simplifications. I assume a cyclical protocol where the order in which countries talk is known. I assume that countries talk in the order given by the ordinality, which simplifies the calculations. And I assume stationarity, which is important. It gives me at the end uniqueness. But the challenge is to show that despite the more complex model, you still get uniqueness thanks to stationarity in this particular model as well. So what do we have as a summary of all this as a result? And what does it mean? So each country submits an unconditional NDC, which is the Nash equilibrium as said before. And in addition, they submit a conditional NDC consisting of fed of abatement, which is going to be the first best in this framework. In the short term, first best, not the long term first best, as we will discuss later. But this would be able to have, if you have a truly multilateral binding agreement at the end, in the implementation phase, you will have a first best. But now the share that each one obtains is going to be defined by the cost of revoking. So if you are more uncompromising, if you will get a larger share than if you are very compromising. So it is basically how willing you are to change your position is what is going to determine how much you get, having more if you have a very high cost of revoking. So what is also important that of course, in this ideal equilibrium, which is something which is of course not what is in reality going to happen, but finally there would be no cost of revoking because of course everyone foresees what is going to happen in the future. And basically you are submitting precisely the optimal level as your initial pledge already. So at the end, all countries will have the PI as a payoff, which be what they have in this agreement, plus this share, this ideal share, which coincides with what they have in this very ideal situation already as initial pledge as well. Of course, you can. Yes.
I just have a question for you. Just the slide before, please. The value KI, so it is an exogenous parameter, and it means when your KI is high, you will have a higher share of the total surplus which will be created by cooperation. So it means in that way, for instance, when you bargain and we tie your hands, imagine you bargain and you need the agreement of a Senate, of a referendum, for instance. In that case, you will be more aggressive in the negotiation and you will get more. Is it the idea?
Yeah, that's the idea. Yes, that's the idea. So okay. for countries which have it hard to change their position during the negotiation, they will suffer. They will get more because they are more uncompromising.
But of course, at the equilibrium, in fact, you are never disappointing because the share you ask, the share you want to have, in fact, is the effective share you will have.
Yeah, because this is again, it's a complete information game. So you know exactly that this exogenous parameter, so the cost of revoking, is going to be determining the shares that you will get ultimately, and that's why you ask for that.
Okay.
So that's, yes, in equilibrium, out of equilibrium, you can pay this cost of revoking, but in the equilibrium, you will not pay it anymore.
No, okay, but this term, this term KI are in your payoff because of equilibrium, it may happen. And that's why this term is important for your story. Okay.
That's it. They appear and throughout the proof, they're driving the results because they could potentially, as soon as you move a little bit of the equilibrium, that's why, so no deviation is profitable because as soon as you move, you have this cost intervening. So okay. they're fundamental to determine and to pinpoint the precise equilibrium at this cost that you have of revoking your pledge. So as I said, this cost is, for you can revoke your pledge always, but it has a cost. And if you revoke it, and this cost depends on exogenous factors because it depends whether you are a country where you have a lot of a green pressure pushing you to do an ambitious target. You have lobbies that may say that you need to ask a lot of money from the north because we are very poor. And then that is all exogenous to my model. What is your particular KI?
Okay, thank you.
So in words, countries in the same proposition in words. Countries agree on the abatement level that maximizes the additional surplus to be shared, and each country obtains a share VI of the additional surplus created, plus its payoff in the situation where all countries follow the unconditional NDC. This is what we have seen before. This share is obtained from the additional, depends on the relative cost of revoking, as we just said. In countries with relatively larger cost of revoking, get a larger share. If all have the same cost of revoking, of course, then the different rule holds. As I said before, you can, of course, translate this into transfers. And then you can, this is the expression that you would obtain from the transfer. And then simply your cost would be, your payoff would be what you obtain from the final situation, plus the transfer that you obtain in this situation. That's another form of writing it, but it's simply, it's just to stress that in a bargaining game, you can always write it in terms of a share or in terms of transfer. So a sketch of the proof. From the lemma, we know that unconditional pledges are equal to the Nash equilibrium without interactions. So Q is equal to QA. So we know the equilibrium abatement efforts in the eventuality of an agreement are first best in this multilateral bargaining game in the second implementation phase, as countries have no incentive to leave unexhausted surplus because these are binding agreements. Remember, the pledges are not binding, but the implementation phase agreements, those are binding. As I said here, to simplify, I'm assuming a multilateral agreement. In reality, it would be a set of bilateral, which can build up one upon another. You will also reach the first best, ideally. So focusing now on the 3 players to make it easier to follow. In any equilibrium, you must have that the sum of the final shares equal to 1. If it's larger than 1, we can implement or cannot implement it. You cannot have shares that add to more than 1. And if they add to less than 1, part of the surplus is not appropriated by any country. That can also not be an equilibrium. Nevertheless, there is no obvious reason why the alpha I that you submit initially, so the pledges, have to add up to 1. This is not obvious, but it is also the case because you don't want basically you don't want to incur into revocation costs. And how this works, how do you calculate this? Well, at the implementation phase, the requested shares are of course known. And now at time 0, country 1 makes an offer that leaves 2 and 3 indifferent between accepting it or rejecting it and wait for the period to propose a new offer. So you give a share to each of them so that they are indifferent between accepting or waiting. At time 1, the same. Country 2 makes an offer that leaves 1 and 3 indifferent. At time 3, all offers would make countries indifferent with the shares that they are proposing for everyone and the abatement that they are proposing for everyone, and that what would be accepted in the next proposed by the other player in the next period, and that goes on like that. And this, you can solve this set of equations and you obtain a unique equilibrium. So, however, for this equilibrium to be a equilibrium of the whole game, you also need that it should be true that the implementation here, as I said, I was only doing it with the shares that you're proposing at the end, at the implementation phase. But as I said, to have an equilibrium where you have no loss of payoff, then these shares implemented have to be smaller or equal to the shares asked for. That's again a requirement of your equilibrium. Otherwise, it will not it can be shown that otherwise it will not be equilibrium. So now what I do is first I show that being inequality, I can find a unique equilibrium. And then I show that this is in fact, I can find an equilibrium making these equalities. And then I show that this is in fact a unique equilibrium. So that way I can show that this whole thing has only one solution, and that's the solution that I have shown before. If you want an example very briefly, well, let's consider 5 countries, linear quadratic functions. Now we specify. To make it simple, the BI is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for each of them. B1 has 1, B2 is 2, B3 is 3, and so on. For C1, I make 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I change this, and I give a sigma of 0.95. And for that, I obtain the values that you see here. And basically, what I wanted to show very simply is that, yes, you have a disagreement payoff, which is everyone is doing very little. Here's the effort they do in the disagreement, and they do, of course, more in the full agreement situation. They are also gaining, all of them, more with this new situation, but that's not what this would be the gross payoffs. The net payoffs, you have to take into account the cost of revoking, and then you can write this, as I said before, in terms of alpha, in terms of shares, or in terms of transfers. Of course, in transfers, some are positive, some are negative, and in terms of shares, all of them are positive. Here, I have assumed that all have the same cost of revoking. They don't get exactly the same because you also have to take into account the different B's and C's that they have. But at the end, they get a positive net benefit, all of them, net profit, which is completely different to the one that they would have the gross one. In this particular case, we see that this last player actually would prefer the situation here to this one here, but actually what is always comparing is not this with this. What it's comparing is this with this agreement, which is up down here. But what is also important to see here is that the cost of revoking have a big influence. If you change them, then the same player number 5 is actually now getting most of the payoff. So actually who is paying is going to be different. So the cost of revoking is going to have a huge impact in this game, the way it is set up. Okay. Well, I hope there are no questions at the end, but now would be a good time now I'm going to change from the bargaining game, which I hope is clear more or less now, to the integration of this bargaining game, these 2 stages, into the long-term story of this paper. Well, I will be very brief here, as I said. I'm sorry for that, but I don't think we had time to go into both parts in detail, so I will fly over this part. So we'll have...
You have 10 minutes.
Okay. So we have 4 stages now. So it's the long-term provision, as I said before, Paris Agreement. Then we have long-term investments. Then we have a stochastic variable realized. And then we have an infinite sequence of pledge and implement bargaining interactions as the one that we have had. But the long-term agreement, you can always get out of it. Because remember, the long-term agreement is not one of these binding agreements that we have in the implementation phase. This is the Paris Agreement, and you can always get out because we said all of that is not binding at all, not even under international law. So then we have, this is the graph I showed already before we have been focusing on this part. Now it's the whole thing. Long-term provision covers everything, signature of the Paris Agreement, basically investment state, state of nature, and our implementation phase. So stage 1, countries decide to sign or not a long-term agreement, non-comprehensive provision. So that means you cannot agree on investments. This one can be contingent on the state of nature or not. The provision specifies additional abatement on stage 4 and the associated transfers, but not the investment. So you say, okay, I'm going to give you that much if in the next 20 years, if you do this much in each one of these sort interactions, I will pay you that much. That's one thing that can be said. This specifying the floor basically that we have in the Paris Agreement. As I said, these long-term agreements are not very underdeveloped, and my analysis shows they would be much more important to be very specific, because now they're very unspecific. Now we have basically in these long-term agreements this floor of 100 billion a year, but nothing else. Stage countries, 2 countries decide their investment. So investment I units has a cost of I for country I, and investment is private. The abatement cost in the subsequent stages only for country I. So it's you build a solar plant instead of building a coal plant. That's what you have to decide. And this will reduce your abatement costs in the future. And this will stay for all the period that we're analyzing. Now the state of nature is realized out of finite set of possible states of nature. The probability of each state of nature is known. Once it's observed, it becomes common knowledge. Very simple. Stage 4, countries repeat the pledge and implement process that we just had. If no long-term agreement was signed on stage 1, the pledge and implement process evolves freely, as we have seen before. If a long-term agreement was signed, countries honor the long-term agreement if it is profitable for all parts, taking into account the realization of the state of nature. Otherwise, the long-term agreement is denounced. You get out of this long-term agreement, and the pledge and implement process evolves freely, because you can still have these bilateral agreements if you want. The set of bilateral agreements or a multilateral binding agreement. So payoffs now were simply modified that I introduced in the B. I introduced the theta, the state of nature, and the cost half, of course, the capital I, reducing this cost if you invested more. Investment is a private good. Only countries invest and benefit from it. However, what is important for my model is it affects this agreement payoff of others. When you abate more, a country invests more, it abates more, even in the case of the agreement at stage 4. This is something that doesn't appear in the buyer-seller typical model, although it appeared, for example, also in the paper of Becherel and Tirol, very similar. Country's investment is what is called a self-investment if it's only affecting the disagreement of their own country, and it's a cooperative investment if it affects the disagreement payoff of other countries. That's the standard way it is referred to in this literature. So the first best, well, we have, if we do the first best now that a central planner would do, basically we obtain optimal Q, which is defined by this equation here, and we obtain optimal investment. So here, if we have no long-term provision, then the sequence of bargaining that I said in the short term, they bring us to the short-term first best, they don't bring us the long-term first best. So we would have, this would be where the dashed line crosses the horizontal line would be the first best. We will end up here in this middle situation. If you would be in a buyer and seller model, where there is no affectment of the disagreement payoff, it would be even worse. That's the standard result where you go all the way down here. But because we have this effects which are very similar to the one that I was in Becherel and Tirol, we are up here, we're kind of in the middle. So we have, this is in our particular case, what is the different terms that you have to take into account? So this is one basically given by the conditional NDC. This is so what happens in the case of an agreement. This is the one given by the unconditional NDCs. Both will appear with the self-investment terms, and the cooperative investment terms appears only because it affects the disagreement payoff of others. So it has an impact affecting the disagreement payoff of others. So what is important? The long-term provision, with no long-term provision, abatement, yes, it's optimal for a given level of investment. That's what we have seen in the first discussion that we had of part 1. Yes, it is optimal for a given level of investment, but the level of investment is not optimal, and hence, because our abatement depends on this level, our abatement is also going to be below the optimal level. So it would be for a given level of abatement for investment, but it is not in reality simply because the investment was too low. So we have this problem of the long-term provision. As I said before, the good news was Paris Agreement could provide us a first best in the short term, but not in the long term. And for that, we would need this long-term provisions where you specify the transfers much more detailed than what is right now with this more flow of 100 billion. So if you assume that countries could write agreements based on the state of nature, so saying, I will give you that much if climate change happens to be very bad, but I give you much less if climate change happens not to be so bad, then in short, we will get to the first best. But of course, this is very unlikely that you can write an agreement for such a complex thing like climate change that truly depends on the state of nature. So for that, it is true that we will get the first best, but I don't insist too much on that. But basically, we would get back, the proof is we will go back to the first order conditions of the central planner. The problem is, in reality, of course, it is too complex, and then we cannot write this something which will truly depend on the state of nature, how much transfer you give in each situation. So then we have a different option, which is more in line, which is in the Paris Agreement, where you have this 100 billion a year. So you would specify more precisely for how much abatement you're giving that each year. So you specify, I will give you for this, for going this 100 billion would be 200 million, for example, if you go for the short-term first best. So you specify something like that, not depending on the state of nature. So well, then we will still have underinvestment, but you will be closer to the first best. So that has this, it would still have a role to play, but it would not anymore bring us to the first best. I say this is what is closer to reality. Basically, you will have this form, which is a linear combination of two previous ones that we had, where you will, the thing is that whenever the agreement is such that we are happy with what's said, we will follow it, and then you have to specify the agreement in such a way to go close to the first best that for most states of nature it will be accepted, and this is what it will going to depend how close you are to the stage of nature. So the larger the probability that the theta is within the parameters that give you the way it's going to be honored, the long-term provision will be honored, the closer we'll be get to the first best. So but remember, we always have the possibility not to honor this long-term agreement. We will only do it if it's profitable for all parts. Okay. So if we write it in a way that is profitable in most cases, then we will get close to the first best. If this is not possible, then we will be far away from the first best. So there's a set of interesting extensions, I would argue. Not all countries submit conditional pledges. No, this is not possible because it's a kind of a prisoner dilemma, and all have incentive to submit pledges. That's very important. If the order is not known a priori, as I assume, then you can have a Pareto-dominated situation compared to having no negotiation at all. But this is not so important because I would say internationally it is clear who is the important players. As I said, a set of bilateral regional agreement could suffice if we write us, and when there's a discussion on the stationarity is important. Having ignored stock variable is probably not so important. And here I will kind of finish with saying that important messages would be all countries should submit conditional pledges. There are incentives for that. If the order is not known, pledges will operate inferior solution, but that's not important. And very important that if fully developed, the pledge and implement mechanism can implement the short-term first best. For that, all countries should submit conditional pledges, and Articles 6 and 9 need to be fully developed at the implementation phase. But even in this case, we cannot prevent long-term investment, and for that, we would need to develop fully the long-term part of the story in the Paris Agreement, and we would most likely get closer, but not to the first best. So that would be my presentation.
Thank you, Alejandro. So we have time for question and maybe a clarification of your talk. So is there some questions? So I can give you You can ask directly. I can give you the can talk, and I will allow to speak for you. Well, maybe I will try to ask the first question just to. You said that when during the investment phase that investment is a private good, but when it affects the bargaining the disagreement point of the other countries, it means that in fact your investment become a public good. So it's quite logical that that you will have under investment of this.
Well, but the thing is, it is, any investment is like that because it is a private investment in the sense that it reduces only your costs. But because it reduces your cost, in the case of this agreement, everyone knows that you will do more. That's the basic thing. So that's
Okay.
It's never affecting directly the other ones. It's indirectly affecting the other ones. So it is, if I now invest in Spain invest in a huge solar plant, which makes that my abatement is going to be very cheap in the future. Then when we're sitting down at a table, you and I, you know that for me abatement is very cheap. So you know that if we finally don't reach an agreement, there will be a disagreement, and I will do a lot of abatement anyway, because now for me it's very cheap.
Okay.
So now everyone, the thing is, this is a full perfect knowledge. So everyone knows that if you do a big investment in green technology, for you it's going to be cheaper to abate in the future. So everyone expects you to abate more. So you are improving the bargaining situation of the others. So that's something goes against you doing a lot of abatement. Because
okay, and just to be sure that I understand this part. So what's you make the distinction between a long-term, I would say, binding long-term provision or not binding. I don't know if it is a good term you use. So with the story of underinvestment, so what's this distinction between binding or not binding?
No, but what I'm trying to say then, so we have kind of three things here. So one is the long-term agreement, which is non-binding because it's like the Paris Agreement. It's non-binding because you say you're going to do this floor of 100 billion a year, but you don't have to do it because there's nothing there. It's not even international law. It's binding. So if you would specify more, like I'm proposing, if you would specify, I will give you all developing countries, 100 billion if you do your optimal level of abatement. For example, you specify it. And then in the future, there's a big economic downturn, which is all captured if you want in my uncertainty. I don't do it. I simply say, well, I will not do it anymore, because you can always get out of this agreement without any punishment. So you only do it if you're interested in doing it. Then everyone follows it. But only if everyone is happy with the terms of the agreement, they will follow it. So that's why it's a non-binding, it's very weak. Then we have the pledges that you do in the Paris Agreement. They're also very weak. You can't get out of them at any moment. But here there are already some reputational costs if you get out of them. So here I introduce some reputational costs if you don't meet your pledges. Okay. And then there's the final part, is the binding agreement, which is Article 6 and Article 9. That if you sign an agreement within those, these are binding agreements. Only the last ones are binding agreements. And because they're set out like that in the Paris agreements, if you have a bilateral agreement, this can be considered a binding agreement. This is perfectly fine. And then the thing is that because the last bit is binding, it trickles down all the way back, and it can bring you to the first best, at least in the short term, but it cannot in the long term. That's the main message. For the long term, you have a problem. That's why for this long term investment, for that you still have a problem. That's why. So you're getting closer to the first bit optimum, but you're not getting closer to the long term optimum.
Yeah. So is there some question from the audience? No. So maybe it means that you are very clear. So.
Or very obscure.
Obscure. Yeah. It depends.
Maybe it was too much without a stop for questions. Too much information.
Yes, but in fact, what I try to understand it, you mean in fact that the Paris Agreement is a good agreement, because very often
I'm saying that it is because what is the good thing of the Paris Agreement? So what I've shown is that you are interested in sending the pledges. So once everyone has now an incentive to send pledges, because you're worse off if you don't send a pledge. This can be shown that because basically, if you don't send the pledge, your cost of revoking is zero. Those who have sent will get all the surplus, because they are in a position that they don't want to. So if you don't send a pledge, basically it's the same than having a cost of revoking equal to zero. So those who have sent the pledge have an incentive to keep the pledges, even if it's a tiny one. But because yours is zero, even if their incentive to keep the pledges is tiny, they will have a stronger bargaining position in the future. So that's why everyone wants to send the pledge. Everyone wants to send, whether you're a developed country or developing country, everyone wants to send the pledge. They're also very cheap to send, because you know that, well, this cost of revoking may be very low, but I'm not saying if they're high or low, they may be very low, this cost of revoking, but they're not zero anymore. And as soon as they're not zero, everyone has incentive to send the pledge. So everyone has now sent the pledge, and now the pledges are out. We have Article 6 and Article 9. And now we are seeing, as I said, we are seeing Switzerland with Ghana, Switzerland with Peru. We will see most likely there is a negotiation also between the European Union and China, European Union and United States. Now they're sitting down to make some agreements, and some of them may end up being binding, especially probably the smaller ones, because now you're in a situation that you are interested. Everyone has now an additional incentive to meet their targets, which is these pledges that you have made. So separating in two phases, I think, given the situation that we had with the Kyoto Protocol, where everything was blocked, was a good thing in the sense that the pledges bring the countries to the table. So everyone has an incentive to send a pledge, and once you have sent a pledge, you have an incentive to be at the table and negotiate. Before, you had always the free ride incentive to simply say, well, let the other ones do it. But now, having in this kind of two phases is probably a good idea, because the pledge phase brings everyone on the table. Everyone says now that they have a climate policy, and once you have a climate policy, you are at the table, and then it's easier to get more.
Okay, so I've got a question of Lionel, who say, okay, if you say that all the countries have an incentive to make the pledge, in that case, what do you explain, I will say from a rationality term, why Trump decide to withdraw from the Paris Agreement?
Well, first of all, he withdrew, and it took them 3 years to withdraw. So at the end, when the United States came out, after 1 week, they were back in. So that's the first thing, though. So from the rationality point of view, it's more the long term. So the United States went out and went back in. So that's the first thing. So you can argue that. Second, it was really even very hard to explain, but even for supporters of Trump, it was really a saying, I want to oppose climate change in all its forms, because the Paris Agreement is so weak that that's even Trump took a while to take the decision, because he said he was going to get out most likely, but he took a few weeks to take the decision, because and in his case, I don't think it was really a rational thing. It was simply signaling he wants to oppose climate change in all its forms. Because as soon as you don't oppose climate change in all of forms, you see all the other countries of the world are in with their pledges. And even the United States, as soon as Trump left, they're back in. Because it makes a lot of sense to be in, because it gives you a stronger bargaining position to have a clear pledge. And there also now you're seeing countries are kind of rushing to all have this long-term goal, 2050, which is relatively cheap to make for people in politics, in policy right now, because you have 2050 for European Union, 2060 for China. So everyone wants to have a pledge out there, and an ambition one is possible. So this is a situation which is completely different than what we had before the Paris Agreement, where you had China, you had India, all of them had no goals and had no intention to accept any kind of goals. Now they're accepting goals. Of course, climate change is becoming more important. This is one of the main reasons, of course. But the other one is that having a pledge actually will give you a stronger bargaining position. And it's relatively attractive to send these pledges. And that's why I think it was not a rational decision by Trump not to have a pledge.
Okay, but if I try to follow the question, when Biden decided to come back in the argument, it say, in a way, he says that I want to be the leader of the negotiation. And I don't know if in your model you assume a simultaneous bargaining, or is there a role for a leader to manage the negotiation or something like that?
No, there is no role for leader in my model. It's a multilateral, so it is just given by the ordinality. So the one talking first is country number one. So in that sense, it's very aseptic. So I don't really give a leader to anyone. I just say that country number one talks first, number two, second, third, and fourth. But I say that's why it's important also. I say that this order is known for everyone. So in the sense that everyone knows who's going to talk first. So in a sense, I'm giving the number one to the strongest one, who everyone knows is going to play first. So because this captures in a very stylized manner who is the more important player, is the one who's going to talk the first. He will get an additional advantage because of that, of talking first. And I also show in one of the extension that if this would not be the case, if we don't really know who's the strong player, so in my model, if we don't know the order in which they talk, then we would end up paying the cost of revoking, and there would not be any more first best. Why would that be the case? Because now I don't know in which position I'm going to talk. So I'm not completely sure which one is going to be my optimal share, because my optimal share will depend on the position I finally end up talking. So when I do, when I submit my pledge, I have to do a kind of an average share of what I expect to get in the future. And because the average share will not always coincide exactly with the share that you really get, there will be cost of revoking and it will not be optimal anymore. So the model brings the first best only in a world where we have a clear understanding of who are the leaders. My argument is that in reality, we actually know. I mean, it is obvious that Ghana is not a leader and the United States is most likely to be a leader. So I think that reality is closer to what my model captures when it knows the order of when they're going to talk, in the sense that the order is giving you the importance of the countries in the international arena. And then we were able to get the short-term first best. If you're not able to know that, then you will not get any more the first best. So it would be good that we all agree on who's the leader. And right now we have a problem on that side, that the European Union wants to be a leader and thinks they are the leader, and US thinks they are the leader and they also want to be the leader. That's true. We have a particular situation right now where both countries pretend to be the leader.
Maybe a last remark concerning the developing countries. In your model, in fact, you have there is, can imagine transfers from the north to the south, and so the north say, we give you some funds and you will have to make an effort. But in general, so this is your conditional conditional reduction. But of course, we know that funds maybe never arrived, or
well, yes,
Southern countries didn't receive the funds, so they decide to do nothing. So maybe it could be more interesting to make some conditional transfer based on what the countries have done before. Because in this case, I received nothing, so I will do nothing. So maybe you have to make a small effort, and in that case, you will receive funds.
Yeah, this is not specified in my model because, as I said, it's a binding agreement. So if you say you're going to send that, you will send it. But yes, you're right. In reality, you're absolutely right. I mean, you have right now this flow of 100 billion, but don't know if it's going to ever arrive or not. So I fully agree. So yes, this is something which is a big problem, which is beyond my model, in the sense that I assume that if you may break your pledge, but once you have signed an agreement, you will pay that. I must also say that in reality, most of these agreements, especially bilateral agreements, are honored. So this agreement that now Switzerland has done with Peru, it will be very unlikely that Switzerland doesn't pay the money to Peru that they promised. That would be very unlikely, very, very unusual. So different thing is when you say in the pledge situation, we are all together gonna give 100 million. Well, that's 100 billion a year. No one knows who's gonna give it. That's very unclear. But once you had a proposal of, in this particular case, a bilateral agreement, the leader from the Switzerland saying, Peru, I will give you that much in exchange of abatement effort at home, it is very unusual that this kind of agreements between countries are not met. And that is what I'm assuming, that the agreement between Switzerland and Peru, an agreement between Switzerland and Ghana will be honored. And I think this is realistic.
Okay, Alejandro, thank you. it's time. It's 5. So really, thank you for your presentation. The paper is available on the website, so I encourage all the people to have a look on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
It was clear. It was clear. So
thank you very much for the seminar. It was very nice.
Okay. So thank you for. And I will say bye bye. And next. So for the next